right, my name is Silvina Brown. I am the head of careers and employment of the Deakin University Student Society. And this is one of our first videos, a series that we're presenting. And the first one, we have the honor to have one of our first lectures, the one we are always going to remember, because was the one who teach you the first concepts of what criminology means. And this is Andrew Groves. Welcome to our series, and thank you very much for participating on it.
No worries at all. Thank you very much, Silvina. Thank you for the welcome. Happy to be involved. Apologies in advance, though, if you can hear my daughter in the background. One of the joys of
we all have them. So, if you have to tell people who don't know you, who is Andrew Groves? Who are you?
Yeah, really good question. And I guess, well, from a personal perspective, hopefully people would know me as very, open and welcoming and fairly relaxed, hopefully. And hopefully that was a really good experience for many of our first year students as they go through Deakin. In a professional sense, and indeed as it relates to criminology, I have a fairly wide range of interests, spanning corrections, victims, but also, in particular, drugs and drug policy. So I guess the best way to describe myself would be to be a drug scholar. So particularly interested in the way in which we understand, respond to, and I guess criminalise drugs in Australia in particular, with a particular focus on methamphetamines, but also how young people engage in recreational drug use. So looking at things like pill testing. Broadly speaking, I would say I'm a harm reduction scholar, because ultimately my stance on the issue is that I guess in some ways criminology has some role to play in that process, particularly in terms of how we criminalise illicit drugs. But I think also there is a much broader public health responsibility that we have as Australians, as people around the world do, in responding to illicit drugs. So yeah, I think the best way to describe me would be a harm reduction scholar, because certainly there are significant harms associated with illicit drugs, but not just in terms of use. There are certainly harms associated with how we actually criminalise and regulate the use of illicit drugs in Australia.
Yeah, I do agree with you, absolutely. So let's describe Australia in 3 words. Tough, isn't it?
It certainly is tough, and I did have to think twice about this process, but and I'm not sure if this applies generally, or whether it's more of a if it can be applied in a criminological sense. But when I think about Australia, and in doing so, I recognise that in some ways my experience of Australia is different from many others in the community. But certainly I would describe Australia as laid back, opportunistic and welcoming. That said, I know that I don't necessarily, I can't speak for a whole range of different groups in the community, and so I know that there have been challenges in the past with particularly vulnerable groups experiencing what it means to live in Australia. So that's how I would describe it. That's Rosie. So yeah, laid back, opportunity and welcoming.
I absolutely agree with you. I have been in Australia for 8 years, and definitely one of the main things I want everybody to take away from this series of videos is how good we have it in Australia, how lucky we are, and how lucky we are to have access to education that, believe me, is not something very wide in other countries as we believe. So criminologically speaking, in Australia, if again the three formula here, what are the 3 main criminal issues that Australia have today that most worry criminologists?
It's a tough one because I think there are a number of issues that we face in terms of criminology, in terms of the criminal justice system in Australia, and in many ways one of the features of criminology is that it is dynamic. And so I think if you asked me that question in 6 months' time or 6 months ago, it would have been a different response. But certainly I've picked 3 because I think they are indicatives of some of the broader challenges that we face. and hopefully they cover a wide range of elements that people can latch onto and understand as things that we need to improve on. So the three that I have identified, and certainly other scholars may agree or disagree, but domestic violence, or domestic and family violence, environmental crimes, and also, I know it's quite a broad category and not necessarily a specific category of crime, but corporate offences or white collar offences, the influence of corruption, and even to some extent the participation of governments in actions or occurrences that aren't necessarily what I would necessarily classify in the best interests of Australians. They're the three main areas that I think we could improve upon, and certainly that we need to know more about in terms of criminology. And there are also three elements or three areas of crime that are contemporary, but also there's a lot we can learn from, even in recent years. So to my mind, there are three areas that criminology as a discipline can really focus on over the next 5 to 10 years to make some significant changes, not just in terms of policy and praxis, but also greater understanding and awareness in the Australian community.
It's interesting, yeah. So, you know that I am always very interested on multicultural things and trademark crimes from one country to the other, and crimes who are made in one country and they keep there, and then some others come to other countries with migration. And being Australia such a broad multicultural society, is any crimes that you identified as a result of immigration?
An interesting question, and certainly I know that, or particularly in the last, say, 10 to 15 years, there have been various occasions of what we could call moral panic, where there have been concerns about perhaps criminal justice issues or even criminality associated with immigration. And as a criminologist, I think it's really important to reflect on those moments, because I think it says a lot about the system, as well as the way in which we respond to some of these issues, rather than the crimes themselves. Because we know that there is research that tells us that, as it relates to immigration, that quite often there are many peaks and troughs with regard to crime as it relates to newly immigrated communities. So as different communities immigrate to Australia, obviously there's going to be some challenges socially, culturally, blending in, becoming, finding out what it means to actually live in a country like Australia. And so there is research that says that during those periods, there can be some spikes in crime because of lack of awareness, getting used to our different laws and practices in our country. But what the research says is that in terms of the relationship between crime and immigration, there's no strong link there. It's not that there are certain communities that are more criminogenic than others. And obviously, unfortunately, we know that in the past that has been, those kinds of claims have been used politically, or have been politically motivated to get a sense of, well, is it the Greek community? Is it the South Sudanese community? Is it those that are associated with Middle Eastern countries? That there have always been these moments of moral panic. And in some ways that drills down to this broader idea of what we see in criminology of it's the problem with difference and the problem with other groups. We're always constantly trying to justify criminal behaviour in terms of it's different from what we are doing, and othering or labelling other groups of the community. And for that reason, I think it's important when you're talking about immigration to note that, yes, there is a relationship there, but it's not necessarily what, sorry, just getting a phone call. It's not necessarily what governments and criminal justice systems or institutions might have you believe in regards to certain communities being more criminogenic or more likely to engage in crime. Yeah.
And also, it's what you said before. I mean, it's one of the first words you hear when you start studying criminology, and is this moral panic, and how press, how serious portrayed certain things are absolutely very wrong with the way they portrayed it and the perception of the people through what they read and where they get the information from. I mean, I'm from Argentina, I'm Latin, and in the United States, it's not one time that I go to the supermarket that they don't check my bag, for example, just to give you an example. So what made you decide to become a criminologist? When was the last thought you had, the first thought you had, I want to do this?
Just before I answer that question, I think it's important to flag, and I apologize I didn't say this in the first response. I think when it comes to immigration, I think there's an element there that's perhaps outside of the square, or something that I encourage your listeners to think about is, in terms of the relationship between crime and the criminal justice system and concepts like immigration, I think what being a criminologist allows us to do is actually unpack and critique the way in which governments and criminal justice systems actually respond to notions of immigration. So when we think about immigration, we might think of moral panics, as I just mentioned, as you just said, about particular communities committing more crimes in particular areas. And obviously there are important elements to unpack in those specific instances. But I think it's also important to flag that states can actually be just as topical when it comes to understanding the relationship between crime and immigration. Because just as an example, if you look at our human rights obligations in regards to how we manage immigration, how we might deal with detention of certain groups who are deemed to be, non-lawful citizens, those kinds of responses. So it's important to kind of get outside those stereotypical responses. Yes, of course, we need to be concerned about changes to our communities, but I think we need to be more aware of the benefits of being welcoming and understanding the value of evidence-based decision-making and avoiding some of those moral panic issues that we see, exacerbated by media and so on. So perhaps to encourage your listeners and anyone who's interested in crime and criminology is to think about, yes, we need to be mindful of if there are peaks and troughs in crime, but also to what extent are governments responsible and states responsible for some of these issues in regards to immigration. So, and I think the best example of that is the Biloela family and how they've been treated in regards to their efforts to seek asylum in Australia. So just some examples for people to think differently about that process. But just coming back to your second question about how I thought about being a criminologist, or what motivated me to be in this position. Again, a really good question. For me, it was, I always knew that, growing up and moving through secondary education, I'm always interested in helping people. And a key feature of that was understanding how the law in particular and how the criminal justice system impacts various groups in the community. And so as I moved into between secondary schooling into university, I had a passion during high school for wanting to be a lawyer, because I thought that was where you could make the biggest impact. But as I moved into university, I studied behavioural science and criminology, and for me it was about understanding behaviour in the sense of how it can be applied to reducing or preventing this thing called crime. As many of you and your listeners would have learnt from studying in first year, crime is this incredibly subjective phenomena that is shaped by a whole range of social, economic, cultural, familial, economic forces. And so it's about understanding those relationships. And I think that's what being a criminologist is about, because you get a sense of what those interrelationships and factors and influences, how they relate to this broader notion of crime, and understanding how communities construct crime, but also hopefully, and this is again comes back to my my underlying principles as a harm reduction scholar. For me, it's about reducing crime and reducing harms associated with crime, obviously as it relates to drugs and drug policy. But I think ultimately, as a community, if there was less crime and greater perceptions of security and safety, then of course that's an aspirational goal that we all have. But that's my underlying. I know that's a little bit cliche in some ways, wanting to help people, but I feel like there is an opportunity as a criminologist to do that in really specific ways. Yes, it's about developing theory and building knowledge and increasing awareness of how we understand crime. But also there's an opportunity as a criminologist to do empirical research, build that evidence base that we can then use to inform policy and inform practice within our communities. And so if, for instance, just as an example, if we can change how we respond to a particular problem, let's say it's illicit drugs, if we can apply a more harm reductionist perspective, reduce the number of deaths associated with illicit drugs, then is that not a good thing for our community, regardless of what the criminal law necessarily says about that process? And so, yeah, I think that's a really good indication of how you can take a very simple, perhaps cliched motivation and take it, expand it through to a career. Because as a criminologist, as each of you will know, you can apply yourself in any way really to improve the community.